They say you can't smell death through a screen. But if you could, January 10th, 1475 would reek of it. 40,000 corpses, frozen in mud, drowned beneath ice, scattered across a valley that became the graveyard of an empire's pride. This is the story of how a prince with 40,000 men butchered an army of 120,000 and made the most powerful empire on earth afraid to ever come back. 120,000 Ottoman soldiers marched into Moldavia that winter. Warriors who had conquered Constantinople. Janissaries trained from childhood to know nothing but killing. Cavalry that had shattered Christian kingdoms, from Greece to Bosnia. An army so massive that when they crossed the Danube River, it took 3 days for them all to reach the other side. They came to crush a rebellion, to teach a lesson, to install a puppet ruler and collect tribute like they'd done 100 times before across the Balkans. Only one man stood in their way, Stephen the Great of Moldavia, a prince whose father was murdered when he was a boy, who grew up in exile learning war from the family of Vlad the Impaler, who took his throne through blood and held it through brilliance. When the Ottoman Sultan demanded tribute, gold, and 500 Christian boys to be turned into Muslim warriors, Stephen's response was simple: "I will not sell my people into slavery." That refusal signed a death warrant. Not his, theirs, because what happened next wasn't a battle. It was a massacre so brutal, so one-sided, so perfectly executed that when news reached the Pope in Rome, he couldn't believe it. When it reached the Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople, he was so humiliated he'd personally invade Moldavia the next year with an even larger force just to salvage his reputation. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been told the odds are impossible? That you can't win? That you should just give up because the math doesn't work in your favor? That's where Stephen stood in December 1474. An empire 3 times his size marching toward his borders with the most feared army in the world. Every advisor probably told him to run, to surrender, to beg for terms. Instead, he laid a trap. Not just any trap. A death trap so elaborate, so devastating, that it would turn winter itself into a weapon, that would use fog, frozen marshes, and terrain to make Ottoman numbers meaningless, that would transform a small force of peasants and mercenaries into executioners. Here's what the Ottoman generals didn't know as they marched north through blizzards. Stephen had already won. He'd won the moment they decided to invade in winter. He'd won when they chose to advance through his territory instead of waiting for spring. He'd won because while they were confident in their strength, he'd spent months preparing to turn that strength into their coffin. Suleiman Pasha, the Ottoman commander, was no fool. He'd crushed rebellions in Albania. He'd fought in Bosnia. He knew warfare. His 30,000 janissaries were the elite of the elite. Christian boys taken from their families, converted to Islam, trained until they became weapons. His 20,000 Sipahi cavalry wore armor that could turn aside sword strikes. His artillery had reduced castle walls to rubble. But none of that mattered when you're drowning in a frozen river with arrows in your back. None of it mattered when peasants with axes are swarming your position because the fog is so thick you can't see 10 feet in front of you. None of it mattered when your own allies are routing, trampling your forces in their panic to escape the killing ground you'd been lured into. This is the Battle of Vaslui, one of the most brilliant military victories in history, one of the most savage, one of the most one-sided slaughters ever recorded. And it happened because a prince who'd spent his life preparing to survive against impossible odds finally got his chance to prove that sometimes genius beats numbers, strategy beats strength, and a small nation defending its home can make an empire bleed. The Ottomans brought 120,000 men into Moldavia. 40,000 never left. And the way it happened, the tactics, the brutality, the sheer calculated violence of it, will change how you think about medieval warfare forever. This wasn't knights in shining armor having honorable duels. This was strategic slaughter. This was turning terrain into a meat grinder. This was one man's refusal to kneel transforming into a bloodbath that echoed across continents. Pope Sixtus IV called Stephen champion of Christ after this battle. European kingdoms celebrated in the streets. But here's the real question. How does a force 3 times smaller completely annihilate a professional army? How do you take the warriors who conquered Constantinople and leave them face down in frozen swamps? The answer is coming. But first, you need to understand the prince who made it happen, the empire that underestimated him, and the collision course between faith and conquest that led to one frozen valley in Eastern Europe becoming a charnel house. Before we get there, if this is the kind of hidden history that makes your blood pump, if you want to see how underdogs don't just win, but obliterate the odds stacked against them, hit subscribe right now, because this channel exists to tell the stories they don't teach in classrooms. The brutal ones, the brilliant ones, the ones that prove history is written by whoever survives to tell it. And trust me, what Stephen did to survive will haunt you. The Ottoman Empire thought Moldavia was just another conquest. They had no idea they were about to learn what happens when you corner a wolf. To understand why 40,000 Moldavians could slaughter 120,000 Ottomans, you need to understand the man who made it possible. And Stephen the Great's story doesn't begin with glory. It begins with murder. A boy is born in Moldavia to Prince Bogdan II. Should have been a story of privilege, of learning to rule, of eventually inheriting a throne. Instead, it became a story of survival, because in the vicious political landscape of 15th century Eastern Europe, bloodlines meant nothing when ambition and betrayal were the currencies of power. Stephen was just 14 years old when his father was assassinated, not by foreign enemies, not by Ottoman infiltrators, by his own cousin, Peter Aaron, in a power grab so brutal it sent shockwaves through the region. Bogdan II was murdered alongside 40 loyal boyars, nobles who'd stood by him. The message was clear: loyalty meant death. Power went to whoever was willing to kill for it. Stephen ran. What else could a 14-year-old do when the man who murdered your father now sits on your throne? He fled to Transylvania first, then to Wallachia, always one step ahead of assassins, always wondering if today would be the day his cousin's reach finally caught up to him. But exile did something unexpected to Stephen. It forged him. While other princes his age were learning courtly politics and diplomacy, Stephen was learning how to survive. And his teacher, Vlad II Dracul, father of the man who would become infamous as Vlad the Impaler. Let that sink in for a moment. The Dracul family didn't just teach warfare. They taught psychological warfare, terror as a weapon, the art of making your enemies so afraid that they'd rather flee than fight. Young Stephen watched. He learned. He absorbed lessons that would serve him decades later when he faced his own existential threat. For years, Stephen lived as a ghost, a prince without a principality, an heir without inheritance. Most exiled royalty in this position simply faded into history, taking positions in foreign courts, marrying minor nobles, accepting that their claim to power had died with their fathers. Stephen refused to accept it. 24 years old now. No longer a frightened boy, but a man hardened by exile and burning with purpose. He gathered supporters, boyars still loyal to his father's memory, warriors willing to gamble on a revenge plot. With Hungarian backing from Matthias Corvinus, Stephen invaded his own homeland. The Battle of Vaslui wasn't just about reclaiming a throne. It was personal. Peter Aaron, cousin who'd murdered his father, stood on the opposite side of that battlefield. When the fighting ended, Stephen didn't just defeat him. He captured him. And then, with cold deliberation that showed exactly what kind of ruler he'd become, Stephen personally beheaded the man who'd stolen his childhood. The coronation at Sisiava Citadel marked a new era. Stephen III, now called Stephen the Great, took power not through inheritance, but through blood and determination. And he'd learned a critical lesson from his years of exile. In Eastern Europe, surrounded by empires, survival meant being smarter, more ruthless, and more strategically brilliant than everyone trying to destroy you. Because Moldavia wasn't just a country. It was a buffer state in the worst possible location. Look at a map of 15th century Eastern Europe, and you'll see the problem immediately. To the north, Poland under King Casimir IV, always looking to expand influence. To the west, Hungary under Matthias Corvinus, ambitious and powerful. To the east, Tatar hordes from the remnants of the Golden Horde, raiders who'd sweep in without warning. And to the south, growing larger and more threatening every year, the Ottoman Empire. Stephen understood something most rulers didn't. You couldn't survive by being strong. Moldavia would never be strong enough to defeat any of these powers in a straight fight. You survived by being unpredictable, by making alliances when necessary and breaking them when survival demanded it, by making yourself too costly to conquer, even if you couldn't prevent them from trying. The 1460s tested this philosophy repeatedly. In 1462, Stephen allied with Vlad the Impaler, his old mentor's son, against an Ottoman invasion of Wallachia. They won battles, but ultimately lost the war when Vlad was captured. Wallachia fell under Ottoman control, governed by puppet rulers who paid tribute in gold and slaves. A grim preview of what awaited Moldavia if Stephen ever faltered. Stephen captured Chilia, a crucial fortress and port on the Danube. Economically, it was brilliant. Controlling trade routes meant revenue. Strategically, it was a declaration. Moldavia wouldn't just defend its borders, it would expand when opportunity arose. But it also drew attention. Dangerous attention. Sultan Mehmed II, sitting in Constantinople, noticed. This was the man who'd accomplished what Ottoman sultans had dreamed about for centuries, the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. At just 21 years old, he'd breached walls that had stood for over 1,000 years. He'd ended the Byzantine Empire. He declared himself Kaiser Iram, Caesar of Rome, and meant it. Mehmed didn't tolerate defiance. Couldn't afford to. His empire was built on a simple principle. You either submitted and paid tribute, or you were destroyed. There was no third option. When Moldavia started acting like an independent power instead of a future vassal state, when Stephen captured Ottoman-adjacent territory, when he meddled in Wallachian politics, these weren't just insults. They were threats to the entire Ottoman system. But Mehmed had other priorities in the 1460s. Campaigns in Anatolia, consolidating control in the Balkans, building the new Ottoman state from the ashes of Byzantium. He filed away Moldavia as a problem to solve later. That patience would cost him. 1467 brought a different threat. Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, Stephen's former ally, invaded Moldavia over territorial disputes and unpaid debts. This should have been a disaster. Hungary was powerful, well-equipped, led by one of the era's most capable military minds. Stephen was outnumbered, caught off guard, facing a professional army. The Battle of Baia became Stephen's coming-out party as a military genius. Instead of meeting the Hungarians in open battle, where their superior numbers and equipment would crush him, Stephen used terrain. He lured them into the forested hills around Baia. Then he burned the town itself, using the smoke and chaos to mask his forces' positions. Hungarian cavalry, so deadly in open fields, became targets in the narrow passes. Hungarian infantry, trained for conventional warfare, found themselves ambushed from multiple directions. Matthias Corvinus himself was wounded in the fighting. His army retreated in disorder, and Stephen sent a message to every power watching. Moldavia might be small, but attacking it would be expensive, painful, not worth the cost. But the real crisis was brewing in Wallachia. That buffer state between Moldavia and the Ottoman Empire had become a revolving door of rulers, each one either an Ottoman puppet or trying to break free before being crushed. In 1473, Stephen saw an opening. Basarab the Young, a candidate who might actually stand up to Ottoman pressure, needed support. Stephen invaded Wallachia that November, not with his full army. He couldn't leave Moldavia defenseless, but with enough force to make a difference. The Battle of Ramnik ended with Stephen's victory. Basarab Lyota, the Ottoman-backed ruler, fled. Basarab the Young took the throne. For a brief moment, it looked like Moldavia might have a genuine ally on its southern border instead of an Ottoman proxy. It didn't last. The Ottomans couldn't allow it. Wallachia was too important, geographically, economically, strategically. Within months, they'd reinstalled Lyota with military backing. Stephen's intervention had failed, but it had also done something else. It had finally exhausted Mehmed II's patience. The Sultan sent an envoy to Suceava in early 1474. The message was blunt. Moldavia would pay 2,000 ducats, an annual tribute. Moldavia would provide 500 boys annually for the devsirme, the Ottoman practice of taking Christian children, converting them to Islam, and training them as janissaries. Moldavia would acknowledge Ottoman suzerainty. Moldavia would become a vassal state, or Moldavia would be destroyed. Think about that demand for a moment. 2,000 ducats might not seem like much for a principality, but it was the principle, acknowledging that you were subordinate, that your independence was a privilege granted by Ottoman mercy. The economic strain would cripple Moldavian development, funneling resources south instead of into defense or infrastructure. But the 500 boys? That was the real knife. The devsirme system was genius in its cruelty. Take Christian children from conquered or vassal territories. Raise them as Muslims, loyal only to the Sultan. Train them into elite warriors who'd then be sent to conquer and subjugate other Christians. Force communities to surrender their own sons, knowing those boys would return as enemies. It wasn't just tribute. It was cultural genocide with a smile. Stephen's response was delivered to the Ottoman envoy in front of his entire court. 2 words that sealed Moldavia's fate. I refuse. Not let me consider it. Not, perhaps we can negotiate terms. Not even a diplomatic deflection. Just flat refusal. The envoy warned him what this meant. Warned that armies would come. That refusal meant war, and war against the Ottoman Empire meant annihilation. Stephen didn't blink. I will not sell my people into slavery. The court knew what this meant. The boyars knew. Every soldier in the Moldavian army knew. War was coming. Not a border skirmish. Not a punitive raid. A full Ottoman invasion designed to crush Moldavia so thoroughly that no other vassal would ever dare refuse tribute again. In Constantinople, Mem II received the news of Stephen's refusal with cold fury. He'd conquered Constantinople. He'd subjugated Greece, Serbia, Bosnia, parts of Albania. He turned the Balkans into an Ottoman lake. And now this minor principality, this buffer state that should be grateful to even be noticed by the Sublime Porte, had the audacity to refuse. The Sultan summoned Suleiman Pasha, Beylerbey of Rumelia, governor of the European territories, and one of his most capable generals. Suleiman had fought in Albania against Skanderbeg. He'd crushed Bosnian resistance. He knew how to break Christian principalities that thought they could stand against the empire. Mem's orders were explicit. Assemble the largest force practical. Invade Moldavia. Destroy Stephen's army. Install a puppet ruler. Extract not just the original tribute, but additional payments as punishment. Make it so brutal, so overwhelming, that every other potential rebel from Hungary to the Black Sea would remember what happened to those who defied the Sultan. Suleiman began gathering forces in Adrianople in late 1474. 30,000 janissaries from the empire's elite corps, 20,000 Sipahi cavalry, landed gentry who fought for glory and plunder, thousands of akinsis, light cavalry raiders, artillery units with the cannons that had breached Constantinople's walls, engineers, supply trains, medical corps. But Suleiman went further. He called in allies, Basarab Lyota of Wallachia, grateful for Ottoman support in keeping his throne, pledged 17,000 men. The Crimean Khanate, Ottoman allies against the Golden Horde, sent 20,000 Tatar horsemen. By the time assembly completed, the force numbered approximately 120,000 men. 120,000. For a principality whose entire army numbered 40,000 at full mobilization. The message was clear. This wasn't a punitive expedition. This was annihilation. This was the Ottoman Empire demonstrating that defiance brought overwhelming destruction, that small nations existed only by Ottoman permission, and that permission could be revoked with extreme prejudice. In December 1474, as snow began falling across Eastern Europe, the Ottoman army crossed the Danube at Brăila. Suleiman Pasha rode at its head, confident in his numbers, his training, his experience. He'd fought in a dozen campaigns. He'd never lost on Ottoman business. This would be a demonstration, a lesson, a conquest for the history books. He had no idea he was leading his men into a carefully prepared killing ground, that every day they marched deeper into Moldavia, They were marching closer to the trap, that the small principality they'd come to crush had spent months preparing not to fight them, but to slaughter them. The rising storm was about to break, and when it did, the snow would run red. If this build-up has you hooked on one of history's most brutal reversals, do me a favor. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me, would you have refused the Sultan's demand or taken the deal to save your people? Because Stephen's choice is about to have consequences that echo across centuries, and we're just getting started. December 1474. While Europe prepared for Christmas, two armies prepared for war. On paper, this wasn't a contest. It was an execution. The Ottoman force assembling at Adrianople represented the pinnacle of 15th century military power. 120,000 men from across an empire that stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates. Professional soldiers who'd conquered empires, supported by allies eager to prove their worth. Let's break down what Suleiman Pasha actually commanded, because understanding the Ottoman army makes what happens at Vaslui even more impossible. The corps, 30,000 janissaries. These weren't ordinary soldiers. The janissary corps represented something unique in medieval warfare, a professional standing infantry force taken as boys through the Dufsirm system, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood for one purpose, war. They knew no other life. They had no families to return to, no lands to inherit, no loyalties except to the Sultan and their regiment. Death in battle meant paradise. Retreat meant dishonor worse than death. They fought with yatagan swords, composite bows, and, increasingly, firearms. Ottoman handguns and arquebus that could punch through armor at close range. They drilled constantly. They were disciplined in a way feudal levies could never match. When janissaries formed ranks, they didn't break. They didn't rout. They were the reason the Ottoman Empire could shatter larger armies through sheer professional excellence. 20,000 Sipahis formed the cavalry arm. These were landed gentry, minor nobles who held timars, land grants in exchange for military service. They weren't mercenaries. They had wealth, status, everything to lose, which made them fight harder. They wore lamellar or mail armor, carried lances and composite bows, and their charges had broken Christian armies from Hungary to Anatolia. When Sipahis hit an enemy line, they hit like thunder. Cavalry shock warfare perfected. Then the Akinsis, perhaps 10,000 light cavalry raiders. These were the terror troops, unarmored or lightly armored horsemen who scouted ahead, burned villages, took slaves, spread fear. They didn't hold ground. They harassed, they raided. They destroyed morale before the main army even arrived. Fast, brutal, merciless. Artillery and support units added another 10,000 men. Engineers who'd helped bring down Constantinople's legendary walls. Cannon crews with siege guns and field pieces. Supply corps managing the massive logistics of feeding 120,000 men. Medical staff. Mullahs to lead prayers. This was a complete military machine. But Suleiman hadn't stopped there. He called in the allies. Basarab Lyota of Wallachia brought 17,000 men. These were personal for Lyota. Stephen had invaded his country just a year ago, tried to overthrow him, backed his rival. Now he had a chance for revenge, backed by Ottoman power. His troops were a mix of boyar cavalry and peasant infantry, not as disciplined as Ottomans, but motivated by proximity. Wallachia bordered Moldavia, and successful conquest meant more land, more wealth, higher status with the Sultan. The Crimean Tatars sent 20,000 horsemen under their Khan's banner. These were descendants of the Golden Horde, warriors whose ancestors had terrorized Eastern Europe for centuries. They fought on horseback with composite bows, sabers, lassos to drag enemies from saddles. Lightning raids were their specialty. They didn't need supply trains. They lived off the land, off plunder, off whatever they could take. And they had a reputation for taking everything. Livestock, valuables, people as slaves. The numbers were staggering. The diversity of forces, infantry, heavy cavalry, light cavalry, artillery, meant Suleiman could adapt to any tactical situation. Open field, Sipahis would charge while janissaries provided fire support. Siege, artillery would reduce fortifications, while engineers prepared assault positions. Pursuit? Akincis and Tatters would hunt down fleeing enemies for days. This army had everything: experience, equipment, numbers, professional command, the logistical support of an empire. When they crossed the Danube River at Brilla in mid-December, it took 3 full days for the entire force to reach Moldavian territory. 3 days of continuous crossing. Imagine watching that from Moldavian scouts' positions. An endless stream of warriors, horses, wagons, cannons, flowing across the river like a flood that wouldn't stop. The weather was already turning brutal. Winter in Eastern Europe meant freezing temperatures, snow, roads turning to frozen mud. For most armies, this would delay campaigns until spring. But Suleiman was confident. His force was so overwhelming that weather was an inconvenience, not a threat. They'd crush Moldavia quickly, install a puppet ruler, extract tribute, and withdraw before the worst of winter hit. That confidence, that's what Stephen was counting on. Now let's look at what Stephen had to work with, because the disparity is almost comical. Almost. Moldavia's total military force, when fully mobilized, calling up every able-bodied man, emptying garrisons, pulling in every favor, numbered approximately 40,000, 1/3 the size of the Ottoman invasion force. And most of those 40,000 weren't professional soldiers. The core of Stephen's army was the Curtini, court troops, his personal military retinue, maybe 5,000 professional soldiers. These were boyars, minor nobles who trained for war, who had proper armor, horses, weapons. They were cavalry primarily, skilled with lance and sword, disciplined enough to maintain formation. They were good, but 5,000 good soldiers don't beat 120,000 great soldiers. Another 5,000 came from the boyar class more broadly, landowners who owed military service in exchange for their holdings. These were feudal levies, but educated men who understood warfare, who could afford decent equipment. Heavy cavalry mostly, armored and mail, carrying shields painted with family crests. Competent, brave, outnumbered 24-1. The bulk, 20,000 men, were peasant levies. Farmers, craftsmen, merchants, anyone who could hold a weapon when the great host was called. These men had axes for cutting wood, now cutting flesh. Spears made from farming tools. Maybe leather jerkins for protection if they were lucky. Most had never been in a real battle. They knew how to fight off bandits or wild animals. Fighting professional Ottoman janissaries? That was a different universe of violence. Some had handguns, early firearms, crude and unreliable. These weapons were more psychological than practical at this stage. Loud, smoky, terrifying when they worked. But they misfired constantly, took forever to reload, and accuracy was a prayer to God rather than a skill. Still, they had shock value, and Stephen knew shock mattered. Then there were the allies Stephen had begged, borrowed, and called in favors to acquire. 5,000 secular mercenaries from Transylvania. These were Hungarian-speaking frontier warriors, tough mountain fighters who knew harsh terrain and harsh combat. They fought for pay, but they fought well. Light cavalry and infantry, experienced in the constant border conflicts that defined Transylvanian life. Poland sent 2,000 men under various nobles who'd promised support. Hungary, despite past conflicts with Stephen, sent about 1,800. These weren't massive contingents, but they were professional soldiers from major kingdoms. They brought better equipment, better training, and most importantly, they proved Stephen wasn't completely alone. That mattered for morale. Do the math. 5,000 Curtini, 5,000 boyar cavalry, 20,000 peasants, 5,000 settlers, 2,000 Poles, 1,800 Hungarians, roughly 40,000 total, against 120,000, 3-to-1 odds. Except it was worse than that, because 20,000 of Stephen's force were barely trained peasants with farming tools, while 30,000 of Suleiman's force were janissaries, the best infantry in the world. The quality gap was as vast as the numerical one. Any conventional military analysis would say Stephen should surrender immediately, save lives, accept vassalage, live to fight another day. Conventional military wisdom would say fighting was suicide. Stephen wasn't conventional. While Suleiman's army slowly advanced through blizzards and frozen roads, Stephen was implementing a strategy that went beyond military. It was economic warfare, psychological warfare, environmental warfare, all wrapped into one brutal package. Scorched earth. Stephen issued orders that must have broken hearts across Moldavia. Burn everything the Ottomans could use. Every village in their path, torched. Every barn full of grain, set ablaze. Every well, poisoned with animal carcasses or filled with stones. Livestock that couldn't be driven north fast enough, slaughtered and left to rot, or driven into the forests where Ottoman foragers would never find them. This wasn't just denying resources. This was psychological. Imagine you're an Ottoman soldier marching through Moldavian territory in December. You're cold. You're tired. The snow is falling. And everywhere you look, you see burned villages, charred timbers, empty fields, wells that won't give water. Your supply train is struggling through frozen mud. Your officers promised this would be quick, but you're hungry, and there's nothing to forage, and the locals have vanished like ghosts. That's demoralizing. That makes you wonder if this campaign was a mistake. That makes you want to finish quickly and go home. But Stephen wasn't done. He unleashed guerrilla warfare on a scale that foreshadowed modern partisan tactics. Small bands of Moldavian fighters, peasants who knew every trail, every forest, every hiding spot, harassed the Ottoman advance relentlessly. Scouts riding ahead, ambushed, arrows from the tree-lane. Then the attackers melted into forests before retaliation could come. Foraging parties sent to find food, they'd ride out with 20 men and return with 12, the others dead or missing. Supply wagons set on fire in night raids. Sentries found dead at their posts, throats cut silently. The Tatars, usually the ones spreading terror, found themselves terrorized. They'd ride into villages expecting plunder and find nothing but ashes. They'd chase Moldavian raiders into forests and get separated, picked off one by locals who knew the terrain. Their reputation for invincibility started cracking. This is what Stephen understood that Suleiman didn't. In Moldavia, Stephen wasn't just commanding an army. Every peasant was a potential soldier. Every forest was a fortress. Every frozen marsh was a trap. The land itself was his ally, and winter was his enforcer. Suleiman's advance slowed to a crawl. The weather worsened. Supply lines stretched longer and thinner. Morale started eroding. Reports reached him that his men were suffering from cold, hunger, disease spreading through camps. The quick campaign he'd planned was turning into a slog, but he kept advancing, because turning back meant failure, meant admitting that 40,000 Moldavians had stopped 120,000 Ottoman warriors. That was impossible, unthinkable. So he pushed forward, convinced that when battle finally came, when his janissaries formed ranks and his sipis charged, numbers and quality would prevail. Stephen had chosen his ground carefully. Near the town of Vaslui, there was a valley. The Barlad River ran through it, frozen now in January's grip. Hills and forests flanked it. The ground was marshy even when frozen, soft earth that wouldn't support heavy cavalry charges, narrow enough that a larger force couldn't deploy its full width effectively. It was perfect, a natural killing ground, and Stephen had spent weeks preparing it further. Hidden positions for archers in the tree lines, camouflaged artillery emplacements on the hillsides, sabotaged bridges that looked intact but would collapse under weight, paths that seemed passable but led into deeper swamps. By early January 1475, both armies were converging on that valley. The Ottomans, exhausted from weeks of cold and hunger and harassment, but still confident in their overwhelming force. The Moldavians, terrified but trusting in their prince who'd never lost when he chose the battlefield. Stephen gathered his commanders on January 9th. He outlined the plan one final time. It was audacious, brutal. It required perfect timing and discipline. It required his peasant levies to stand against janissary charges. It required his cavalry to strike at exactly the right moments. It required fog, which wasn't guaranteed. It required the Ottomans to make the mistakes Stephen needed them to make. His commanders asked the obvious question: what if it doesn't work? What if the fog doesn't come? What if the Ottomans don't take the bait? What if we're simply overwhelmed? Stephen's response was cold pragmatism. Then we die. But if we surrender, we die slowly as slaves. At least this way, we die fighting. And maybe, just maybe, we make them bleed so badly that they never come back. He dismissed his commanders to their units. Then he rode to Putna Monastery, the religious heart of Moldavia. He prayed through the night, not for victory. He was too pragmatic to assume God guaranteed outcomes. He prayed for courage, for his men to stand firm, for the chance to prove that faith and strategy could overcome numbers. As dawn approached on January 10th, 1475, fog began rolling across the valley. Thick, impenetrable, the kind of fog where you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Stephen smiled. God had answered at least one prayer. The trap was set. The bait was ready. And 120,000 men were about to march into the most perfectly executed ambush in medieval military history. The slaughter was about to begin. January 10th, 1475. Dawn broke over the Barlet Valley, but no one could see it. The fog was absolute. Dense white walls of mist that swallowed sound, that turned the world into a ghost realm where shapes moved like phantoms and direction became meaningless. It was the kind of fog that made soldiers nervous even in peacetime, the kind that made you reach for your weapon because you couldn't see threats until they were on top of you. For the Ottoman army, exhausted from weeks of winter marching, hungry from scorched earth, frustrated from constant guerrilla harassment, this fog was one more misery in a campaign that had stopped being glorious weeks ago. They'd camped overnight in the valley approaches, expecting to meet the Moldavian army in open battle this morning, expecting to finally end this and go home. For Stephen and his 40,000 Moldavians, hidden in the forests on the hillsides overlooking the valley, the fog was a gift from God, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Because what Stephen had planned required invisibility, required the enemy to be blind while he could see, required chaos. Suleiman Pasha woke to the fog and cursed. Battle in these conditions would be messy, confused. But he had overwhelming numbers. Even in fog, even with visibility down to nothing, 120,000 men would crush 40,000. The math still worked. They'd advance through the valley, make contact with the Moldavian forces, and weight of numbers would decide the outcome. He had no idea the Moldavians weren't waiting to fight. They were waiting to slaughter. Stephen had positioned his forces with surgical precision. The main army, his Catini, his Boyar cavalry, the professional soldiers, hidden in the forests on the hillsides flanking the valley. Archers positioned in the trees, invisible in the fog. The few cannons he possessed, captured Hungarian artillery pieces, camouflaged on elevated positions, with clear sight lines down into the valley approaches. His peasant infantry scattered in smaller units throughout the forests, ready to swarm. And the bait, a small force of about 2,000 men under his Logofat, his chancellor, positioned at the valley's far end. Visible, seemingly vulnerable. Their job wasn't to fight. Their job was to run, to lure the Ottomans deeper into the killing ground. As morning progressed, Ottoman scouts reported Moldavian forces ahead, a smaller contingent that seemed to be withdrawing. Suleiman saw opportunity. If the Moldavians were retreating, that meant they were afraid, meant they'd realized the impossibility of their position. He could catch them, crush them before they escaped, end this campaign in one decisive engagement. He ordered the advance. The Akinsis and advance elements, like cavalry, eager to chase down fleeing enemies, moved first. Behind them, the main Ottoman columns began entering the valley, the Wallachian forces under Lyota, keen to prove their worth. Then the core Ottoman units, Janissaries and Sipahis, professional and disciplined despite the terrible visibility. The valley funneled them. This is what Stephen understood about terrain warfare. Numbers don't matter if you can't deploy them. The valley was narrow enough that the Ottoman force couldn't spread out. They were compressed into a column, with units unable to support each other effectively because the fog made coordination impossible. The Moldavian bait force kept moving, staying just visible enough to keep Ottoman attention, leading them deeper. The Akinsis pursued eagerly. This is what they did: chase, kill, plunder. Easy prey ahead. Why wouldn't they chase? They rode straight into the swamp. The valley floor, which looked solid, which seemed passable, was frozen marsh. The surface ice could hold a man on foot, maybe. But horses? Cavalry and armor? The ice cracked. Horses plunged through into freezing mud that grabbed legs like quicksand. Riders were thrown. Others tried to turn back, but the forces behind them kept pushing forward, not knowing what was happening at the front. Everywhere, from nowhere, like the land itself was screaming. Then the arrows came. Moldavian archers, positioned in the tree lines flanking the valley, unleashed volleys. They couldn't see individual targets in the fog. They didn't need to. The Ottomans were compressed in the valley below. The arrows fell like deadly rain, finding flesh, finding horses, creating chaos. Men screamed. Horses panicked. Units tried to form defensive positions, but couldn't see the enemy. Couldn't see anything except white fog and shadows, and arrows materializing from the mist. The cannons opened fire. The sound was apocalyptic in the fog. Massive booms that shook the ground, that disoriented everyone. Chain shot designed to cut through multiple men. Cannonballs that bounced through packed formations. The Moldavians had positioned their artillery perfectly, pre-aimed at the valley choke points. Every shot hit something. Ottoman discipline started fracturing. The Akinsis at the front, trapped in the swamp, were being cut down by arrows they couldn't see coming. The Wallachian forces, less disciplined than the Ottoman corps, started wavering. This wasn't the easy conquest they'd been promised. This was a nightmare. Suleiman tried to rally. He ordered his janissaries forward, ordered them to locate the enemy positions, return fire. Janissaries began shooting blindly into the fog, their firearms creating massive clouds of smoke that made visibility even worse. They were shooting at ghosts, at sounds, at nothing. And then Stephen unleashed his cavalry. The Boyar cavalry, heavily armored, lances ready, charged from both flanks simultaneously. They knew the terrain. They knew exactly where the safe paths were, where the ground was solid. They emerged from the fog like demons, hitting the Ottoman flanks at full gallop. The impact was devastating. Lances punched through armor. Horses trampled infantry, who couldn't form ranks in time. The Moldavian cavalry weren't trying to hold ground. They hit hard, killed fast, then withdrew back into the fog before the Ottomans could organize counterattacks. Hit and run. Strike and vanish. The Ottoman force, so powerful in open battle, so professional in conventional warfare, was being torn apart by an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't reach, couldn't fight. This wasn't war as they knew it. This was being hunted. The Sipahis tried to countercharge, to bring their cavalry power to bear. But the terrain betrayed them. Charging through swampy ground and fog, horses broke legs. Riders lost formation. They rode into trees, into marshes, into ambushes. The Moldavian forces would let them pass, then attack from behind. The fog made every direction deadly. Panic started spreading. The Wallachian contingent under Lyotta, seeing their allies slaughtered, began retreating. Some Wallachians, remembering that Stephen had backed their previous ruler, seeing Ottoman promises of easy victory turning into bloodbath, switched sides entirely. They turned on their Ottoman allies, attacking from within the confused mass. The Crimean Tatars, usually fearless raiders, saw the situation deteriorating and made the calculation every mercenary makes: survival beats loyalty. They began pulling back, abandoning the Ottoman force. Their withdrawal created gaps in the line that Moldavian forces exploited ruthlessly. Suleiman was losing control. His army, so massive, so professional, was fragmenting. Units were fighting isolated battles in the fog, unable to support each other, being picked apart by an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. His artillery, which should have been an advantage, was stuck in the mud. His engineers couldn't set up positions because they were under constant arrow fire. Mid-morning, Stephen committed his peasant infantry. 20,000 men with axes, spears, crude weapons. They swarmed from the forests in waves. In open battle against janissaries, they'd be slaughtered. But in fog, in terrain they knew, fighting enemies already disoriented and demoralized, They were terrifying. The peasants fought with desperate fury. These were men defending their homes, their families. They knew that Ottoman victory meant their children taken for the Devserm, their land under foreign rule. They fought like cornered animals. Axes split armor. Spears stabbed through gaps in defenses. When weapons broke, they used rocks, fists, teeth. The Janissaries fought back. They were still elite warriors, but they were exhausted, hungry, cold, fighting in fog against an enemy they'd underestimated. And the peasants kept coming. Kill one. 2 more appeared from the mist. It was endless. The Ottoman center started collapsing. Units that tried to form wagon lagers for defense found themselves surrounded, cut off from support. The Moldavians would let them form defenses, then simply bypass them, leaving isolated pockets to be dealt with later. The goal wasn't to fight fair. It was to create chaos, panic, rout. By noon, the fog was still thick, but the battlefield had become clear in its horror. The valley floor was carpeted with bodies. Ottoman dead piled so high in places that combatants had to climb over corpses to advance. The frozen Barlad River, where Ottoman soldiers had tried to cross to escape, was choked with drowning men. The ice had shattered under the weight of armored warriors trying to flee. Men drowned in freezing water, or were trampled by their own comrades in the panic. Suleiman himself, surrounded by his personal guard, was trying to organize a fighting retreat. But retreat to where? The Moldavians controlled the hills. They controlled the forests. Every path out of the valley was a death trap. His army wasn't retreating, it was running, breaking, becoming a mob of terrified individuals instead of a disciplined force. Stephen was everywhere on the battlefield. His banner, a black raven on gold, became a rallying point for Moldavian forces and a terror symbol for Ottomans. Chronicles from the battle describe him leading charges personally, sword in hand, his presence giving courage to peasants who were fighting professional warriors. Whether the details are exact or embellished, the psychological impact was real. The Moldavian troops believed their prince was divinely protected, that God was on their side. And the Ottomans? They were starting to believe it too. How else could you explain this? How could 40,000 peasants be destroying 120,000 professional soldiers? It wasn't natural. It wasn't possible. Maybe the Christians were right. Maybe their God was protecting them. That kind of thinking spreads fast in desperate situations. The afternoon brought no relief for the Ottomans. If anything, it got worse. The fog began to lift slightly, and what the survivors could see was apocalyptic. Everywhere they looked, dead, dying, wounded comrades begging for help that wouldn't come. The realization that they weren't going to win, that survival now meant running. The rout became general. Ottoman units that had maintained discipline broke. Soldiers threw down weapons to run faster. Officers abandoned their commands. The mighty Ottoman war machine, which had conquered Constantinople, which had crushed kingdoms, was running in terror from a small principality they'd come to destroy. The Moldavians pursued with merciless efficiency. No quarter given. This wasn't about honor or chivalry. This was about making sure the Ottomans never came back. Every enemy killed now was one less warrior in a future invasion. Stephen's forces hunted fleeing Ottomans through forests, through snow, for miles beyond the battlefield. Small groups of Ottoman survivors, separated in the fog and chaos, were tracked down and eliminated. The Crimean Tatars, who'd abandoned the fight early, were pursued by secular cavalry who knew the terrain. Many Tatars who'd thought they'd escape were caught days later, exhausted and lost. The Wallachians who'd stayed loyal to the Ottomans fared worst. They were seen as traitors by the Moldavians, and no mercy was shown. Suleiman Pasha managed to escape with a fraction of his force. Maybe 10,000 men out of 120,000 made it back across the Danube. 10,000. The rest, dead in the valley, drowned in the river, frozen in the forests, captured and executed. The Ottoman army that had crossed into Moldavia with such confidence was annihilated. As the sun set on January 10th, the battlefield was silent except for the moans of the dying. Moldavian soldiers moved through the carnage, finishing wounded Ottomans, stripping bodies of valuables, counting the dead. The numbers were staggering. Early estimates suggested 40,000 Ottoman dead, though the exact count would never be known. Too many had drowned. Too many were buried in mass graves. Too many had simply disappeared into the frozen landscape. Moldavian losses? Approximately 4,000 dead. 4,000 out of 40,000. A 10% casualty rate while inflicting nearly total destruction on an enemy 3 times larger. It wasn't just a victory. It was one of the most lopsided military victories in recorded history. Stephen stood on the hillside overlooking the valley as darkness fell. He'd won, against impossible odds, using terrain, weather, psychology, and tactics. He destroyed an Ottoman army that should have crushed him. His gamble had paid off. Moldavia had survived. But as he looked at the sea of corpses below, at the blood staining the snow, at the frozen river choked with bodies, he knew this wasn't over. Mehmed II wouldn't accept this. Couldn't. The Sultan's pride, his empire's reputation, both demanded revenge. This victory had bought time. Maybe a year. But the Ottomans would return. Larger, more determined. And next time, they wouldn't underestimate him. For tonight, though, Moldavia celebrated. Church bells rang in Sisiava. Peasants who'd fought and survived embraced families they thought they'd never see again. Commanders who'd doubted the plan now praised Stephen as a military genius. Chroniclers began writing accounts that would spread across Europe. The impossible had happened. 40,000 Moldavians had destroyed 120,000 Ottomans, and the battlefield at Vaslui would be remembered as the place where a small nation proved that faith, strategy, and desperate courage could defeat an empire. The snow continued falling, covering the dead in white. By morning, the valley looked almost peaceful. Almost. But the blood underneath would never wash away. Small groups of Ottoman survivors, separated in the fog and chaos, were tracked down and eliminated. The Crimean Tatars, who'd abandoned the fight early, were pursued by secular cavalry who knew the terrain. Many Tatars who'd thought they'd escape were caught days later, exhausted and lost. The Wallachians who'd stayed loyal to the Ottomans fared worst. They were seen as traitors by the Moldavians, and no mercy was shown. Suleiman Pasha managed to escape with a fraction of his force. Maybe 10,000 men out of 120,000 made it back across the Danube. 10,000. The rest, dead in the valley, drowned in the river, frozen in the forests, captured and executed. The Ottoman army that had crossed into Moldavia with such confidence was annihilated. As the sun set on January 10th, the battlefield was silent except for the moans of the dying. Moldavian soldiers moved through the carnage, finishing wounded Ottomans, stripping bodies of valuables, counting the dead. The numbers were staggering. Early estimates suggested 40,000 Ottoman dead, though the exact count would never be known. Too many had drowned. Too many were buried in mass graves. Too many had simply disappeared into the frozen landscape. Moldavian losses? Approximately 4,000 dead. 4,000 out of 40,000. A 10% casualty rate while inflicting nearly total destruction on an enemy 3 times larger. It wasn't just a victory. It was one of the most lopsided military victories in recorded history. Stephen stood on the hillside overlooking the valley as darkness fell. He'd won, against impossible odds, using terrain, weather, psychology, and tactics. He destroyed an Ottoman army that should have crushed him. His gamble had paid off. Moldavia had survived. But as he looked at the sea of corpses below, at the blood staining the snow, at the frozen river choked with bodies, he knew this wasn't over. Mehmed II wouldn't accept this. Couldn't. The Sultan's pride, his empire's reputation, both demanded revenge. This victory had bought time. Maybe a year. But the Ottomans would return. Larger, more determined. And next time, they wouldn't underestimate him. For tonight, though, Moldavia celebrated. Church bells rang in Sisiava. Peasants who'd fought and survived embraced families they thought they'd never see again. Commanders who'd doubted the plan now praised Stephen as a military genius. Chroniclers began writing accounts that would spread across Europe. The impossible had happened. 40,000 Moldavians had destroyed 120,000 Ottomans, and the battlefield at Vaslui would be remembered as the place where a small nation proved that faith, strategy, and desperate courage could defeat an empire. The snow continued falling, covering the dead in white. By morning, the valley looked almost peaceful. Almost. But the blood underneath would never wash away. The pursuit lasted 3 days. This is what separates a victory from a massacre. What happens after the battle ends? Most medieval commanders, after winning against impossible odds, would consolidate, tend to wounded, secure the battlefield, count their blessings, and prepare for the next threat. Stephen didn't consolidate. He hunted, because he understood something crucial. Letting even 10,000 Ottoman survivors escape meant they'd return with reinforcements. Every Ottoman soldier who made it back across the Danube was intelligence for the Sultan. Every survivor was a future enemy. This wasn't about honor or mercy. This was about making the victory so complete, so devastating, that the Ottomans would think twice, or 3 times, before invading Moldavia again. Moldavian cavalry units, the ones who'd executed the flank charges so perfectly during the battle, now became pursuit forces. They tracked fleeing Ottoman remnants through the forests, through the snow, across frozen rivers. The secular mercenaries, mountain fighters who knew how to track in winter conditions, were particularly effective. They'd find Ottoman survivors huddled in abandoned buildings, trying to start fires, delirious from cold and hunger. No quarter. The Crimean Tatars who'd abandoned the battle early thought they'd escaped. They were wrong. They'd scattered in multiple directions, assuming speed and local knowledge would save them. But Moldavian peasants, the same farmers who'd fought with axes in the valley, knew every trail, every village, every hiding spot. They guided professional soldiers to Tatar positions. The Tatars, accustomed to being the hunters, found themselves the prey. Few made it home to Crimea. Wallachian forces loyal to Lyota faced particular brutality. They were neighbors who'd sided with the invaders, traitors in Moldavian eyes. When captured, they weren't given the quick death that Ottoman soldiers received. Stephen wanted to send a message to Wallachia, to Lyota personally. Collaboration with the Ottomans meant suffering. Chronicles mention captured Wallachians being impaled along roads leading south, a tactic Stephen had learned from Vlad the Impaler. Terror as policy. Make the price of opposing Moldavia so horrific that future rulers would think carefully before choosing sides. By January 13th, 3 days after the battle, the pursuit was winding down. There simply weren't many Ottomans left to chase. Suleiman Pasha himself had escaped with maybe 8,000 to 10,000 men. The exact number would never be clear. These were the ones who'd broken early, who'd had fast horses, who'd been lucky. They straggled back across the Danube at Brilla in small groups, exhausted, traumatized, carrying news that would shock Constantinople. The battlefield itself became a grim accounting exercise. Moldavian forces spent days collecting weapons, armor, standards, anything valuable. 40 Ottoman battle standards were captured, military banners that represented unit pride and identity. Losing your standard in battle was disgrace. Losing 40? That was humiliation on a scale the Ottoman army hadn't experienced in decades. Artillery pieces, including cannons that had helped conquer Constantinople, now belonged to Moldavia. Ammunition stores, supply wagons that hadn't been burned, thousands of horses. The ones that survived became invaluable to Moldavia's military. Armor, swords, bows, firearms. The sheer quantity of captured equipment was staggering. Stephen had started the campaign outnumbered and out-equipped. He ended it with an arsenal. The bodies, though. That was the problem. 40,000 corpses in winter couldn't be left to rot. Disease would spread. Mass graves were dug. Ottoman prisoners and Moldavian peasants working together in the grim task of burial. The frozen ground made it brutal work. Some bodies were simply pushed into the Barlad River through holes cut in the ice. Let the spring thaw carry them downstream. Dark pragmatism. Moldavian casualties, the 4,000 dead, received proper burials. Priests performed services. Families claimed bodies were possible. These men had died defending their homeland, and Stephen ensured they were honored. Widows and orphans would receive support from the state, a policy that Stephen maintained throughout his reign. He understood that soldiers fought harder when they knew their families would be cared for. News of the victory spread through Moldavia like wildfire. Villages that had been burned in the scorched earth campaign began rebuilding, now knowing the sacrifice had meaning. Churches held services, thanking God for deliverance. Stephen became more than a prince. He became a symbol. The man who'd refused the Sultan and survived. The warrior who defended Moldavia when defeat seemed certain. But the real shockwaves traveled beyond Moldavia's borders. When news reached Hungary, King Matthias Corvinus, who'd fought against Stephen at Baia just 8 years earlier, reportedly couldn't believe it. He'd fought the Ottomans. He knew their capabilities. The idea that Moldavia, with its patchwork army, had destroyed a force of 120,000 seemed like propaganda, like Christian wishful thinking, until the reports kept coming, from multiple sources: Polish observers, Venetian merchants, Hungarian nobles who'd sent those 1,800 troops. They all confirmed it happened. The Ottomans were annihilated. Poland celebrated. King Casimir IV, who'd sent 2,000 men and worried he'd sent them to die, received them back as heroes. The political implications were immediate. If Moldavia could defeat the Ottomans, maybe the Ottoman advance wasn't inevitable. Maybe Christian kingdoms could stand against the tide. Polish nobles began discussing more active military cooperation with Moldavia. Venice, the maritime republic constantly at odds with Ottoman expansion, received the news with joy mixed with opportunity. Venetian diplomats began reaching out to Stephen, offering trade agreements, discussing potential alliances. If Moldavia could tie down Ottoman forces in the Balkans, that meant fewer Ottoman resources for naval campaigns in the Mediterranean. Strategic calculus masked as congratulations. But the most significant reaction came from Rome. Pope Sixtus IV, who'd been trying for years to organize a crusade against the Ottomans with minimal success, saw Vaslui as divine intervention. Here was proof that God favored Christian arms against the Muslim invaders. Here was a hero the Pope could rally Europe behind. In a formal declaration, Sixtus IV named Stephen Athleta Christi, champion of Christ. It wasn't just honorary. The Pope sent financial support, 2,000 ducats immediately, with promises of more. Papal bulls were issued calling on Christian kingdoms to support Moldavia. Stephen received ecclesiastical recognition that elevated his status across Europe. He wasn't just a regional prince anymore. He was the defender of Christendom's eastern frontier. Churches across Catholic Europe rang bells, celebrating Vaslui. Priests gave sermons using Stephen as an example of faith rewarded. Chroniclers began writing accounts that would enter the historical record, some accurate, some embellished. Jan de Lugas, the Polish historian, wrote detailed accounts based on eyewitness testimony. His descriptions of the battle, the fog, the ambush, the slaughter, would be primary sources for centuries. The propaganda value was immense. Every Christian kingdom that felt threatened by Ottoman expansion now had a success story, a template, proof that the Ottomans could be beaten. It didn't matter that Stephen's victory required perfect conditions: fog, terrain, winter, tactical genius. What mattered was the outcome. 40,000 beat 120,000. That was the story that spread. But in Constantinople, the mood was very different. Mem II received news of the disaster in late January. Suleiman's messengers, bringing word that the invasion had failed, that the army was destroyed, faced the Sultan's cold fury. There are conflicting accounts of how Mem reacted. Some say he raged, others that he became icily calm. Either way, the message was clear: this couldn't stand. The Ottoman Empire's reputation was built on invincibility, on the understanding that resistance meant destruction. Vaslui challenged that narrative fundamentally. Imagine Mem's position. He'd conquered Constantinople at 21. He'd expanded the empire to its greatest extent. He'd made the Ottoman military feared from the Danube to the Euphrates. And now a minor principality, a buffer state that should have been conquered years ago, had humiliated him, had destroyed a professional army 3 times the size of the defender's force, had made the Janissary Corps, the elite of the elite, look like untrained peasants. It wasn't just military failure. It was political crisis. Vassal states across the Ottoman Empire would hear about Vaslui. They'd wonder, if Moldavia can refuse tribute and win, why can't we? Every tributary prince, every conquered region, every potential rebel now had an example. That was dangerous. That could unravel the careful system of vassalage and terror that held the empire together. Mehmed's response was predictable, overwhelming force. If Suleiman had failed with 120,000, then the Sultan himself would lead 200,000. If a professional army couldn't crush Moldavia, then the combined might of the empire would. This wasn't just about conquest anymore. This was about making an example so brutal that no one would ever dare defy the Sultan again. But that invasion wouldn't come until 1476. Winter was still gripping Eastern Europe. Even the Sultan had to wait for spring, which gave Stephen time to rebuild, time to strengthen defenses, time to leverage his newfound fame into more concrete alliances. Stephen spent the months after Vaslui consolidating his victory. He used captured Ottoman equipment to rearm his forces. He recruited and trained new soldiers, replacing the 4,000 dead with fresh troops. He strengthened fortifications at key positions, Suceava, Houghton, Soroka. He sent diplomatic missions to Hungary, Poland, and Rome, leveraging his status as champion of Christ to secure promises of aid. And he prepared mentally for what was coming, because Stephen wasn't naive. He'd won one battle through perfect conditions and tactical brilliance. The next time, and there would be a next time, the Ottomans wouldn't make the same mistakes. They wouldn't invade in winter. They wouldn't underestimate him. They'd come in overwhelming force with the Sultan himself commanding. And that would be a different kind of war. But for now, in early 1475, Moldavia celebrated. Peasants who'd faced janissaries and survived told stories that would become legends. Boyars who'd charged through fog into Ottoman flanks became heroes. Stephen, the prince who'd grown up in exile, who'd spent his life preparing for this moment, had proven that strategy, faith, and desperation could overcome impossible odds. Here's the question worth asking. What would you have done in Stephen's position? Faced with a demand to surrender your people into slavery, knowing refusal meant invasion, knowing your chances of victory were statistically almost zero, would you have paid the tribute to save lives? Or would you have refused, gambling everything on a plan that required perfect execution? That's not a historical question. That's a human one. Because Stephen's choice wasn't made in hindsight, knowing he'd win. It was made facing probable death, possible annihilation of his country, and the burden of every life lost being his responsibility. He chose to fight anyway. If this story of impossible victory, of a small nation defying an empire, resonates with you, if you're thinking about the choices we make when backed into corners, drop a comment below. Tell me what you'd have done, and share this video with anyone who needs to hear that sometimes refusing to quit against impossible odds isn't stupidity. It's the only way to win. Because the story isn't over. Mehmed II was coming, and the next chapter would test whether Vaslui was divine intervention or beginner's luck. Summer 1476. 15 months after Vaslui, the Ottoman Empire returned. But this time, Sultan Mehmed II himself led the invasion. Not a general, not a beylerbey. The conqueror of Constantinople personally, commanding an army that chroniclers estimated at over 200,000 men. Some sources claim as many as 300,000 when you count support personnel, camp followers, and auxiliary forces. Whatever the exact number, it was the largest military force assembled in Eastern Europe for decades. The message was clear. Moldavia would pay for its defiance, not just with tribute, with annihilation, with becoming a cautionary tale written in blood and ashes. Mehmed couldn't allow Vaslui to stand unanswered. His reputation, his empire's stability, the entire system of Ottoman dominance, all required Moldavia to be crushed so thoroughly that no vassal state would ever dare resist again. Stephen knew this was coming. He'd spent 15 months preparing, strengthening fortifications, training troops, securing promises of aid from Poland and Hungary, promises that, when the moment came, materialized far less than hoped. Because supporting Moldavia against an Ottoman raid was one thing. Standing against the Sultan himself, leading 300,000 men, that required commitment most kingdoms weren't willing to make. The campaign of 1476 was different from Vaslui in every way that mattered. Mehmed invaded in summer, not winter. No fog, no frozen marshes. The weather advantage that had been so crucial at Vaslui didn't exist. The Ottoman forces advanced methodically, scouts carefully checking terrain, refusing to be lured into ambushes. They'd learned, paid for the education in blood, but learned. Stephen tried to replicate his Vaslui tactics. Scorched earth again, villages burned, wells poisoned, livestock driven away. Guerrilla harassment of Ottoman scouts and supply lines. But Mehmed had anticipated all of it. He brought massive supply trains, enough food and equipment to sustain the army without foraging. He deployed cavalry screens so extensive that Moldavian raiders couldn't get close without being detected and driven off. The Battle of Valia Alba, the White Valley or Razbarini, fought on July 26, 1476, became the test of whether Vaslui was repeatable or a one-time miracle. Stephen chose defensible terrain again, positioning his forces on high ground with the White Valley below. He had about 40,000 men again, similar to Vaslui. But this time, the Ottomans weren't marching blind into fog. This time, they could see the trap. And they came anyway, because Mehmed had enough men that he could afford losses. The battle became a grinding, brutal affair. Moldavian forces fought with desperate courage. They'd won once against impossible odds. Maybe they could win again. The fighting lasted hours. Ottoman casualties were heavy. Some sources claim 20,000 Ottoman dead in the initial engagements. Stephen's tactical genius was still evident, using terrain, executing ambushes, making the Ottomans pay for every foot of ground. But numbers eventually matter. When you can lose 20,000 men and still have overwhelming force remaining, when you can rotate fresh troops into battle while your enemy has no reserves, when you can surround positions from multiple directions simultaneously, eventually, quality and tactics can't overcome that disparity. The Moldavian center held as long as humanly possible. Boyars charged Ottoman positions multiple times, each charge bleeding them further. Peasant infantry formed shield walls that were overrun and reformed and overrun again. Stephen himself fought in the thick of it, his Black Raven banner visible throughout the battle, rallying troops who were starting to understand they couldn't win this one. By evening, the Moldavian army was withdrawing, not routing. Stephen maintained enough discipline to retreat in order, to make the Ottomans pay for pursuit, but retreating nonetheless. Valia Alba was an Ottoman victory, costly but decisive. The question now was whether Mehmed could turn tactical victory into strategic conquest. He couldn't. This is where Ottoman victory started crumbling into hollow success, because winning the battle didn't mean controlling Moldavia. Stephen's army, though defeated, wasn't destroyed. It withdrew to fortified positions. Suceava Citadel, capital, held against Ottoman siege. The fortifications Stephen had strengthened after Vaslui proved effective. Ottoman artillery battered the walls, but couldn't breach them. Assaults were repelled with heavy casualties. Meanwhile, disease ravaged the Ottoman camp. Dysentery, typhus, the medieval killers that destroyed more armies than combat ever did. Soldiers who'd survived Valia Alba died in their tents from illness. Supply lines, stretched across hostile territory, where every local was an enemy, began faltering. Mehmed had conquered the field, but couldn't conquer the country. After 3 months of campaigning, fighting skirmishes, besieging fortresses, losing men to disease and guerrilla attacks, Mehmed withdrew. He installed a puppet ruler, Stephen Sultana, in the southern regions of Moldavia that Ottoman forces temporarily controlled. He declared victory, claimed Moldavia as a vassal state, and marched his army back to Ottoman territory. It was hollow. Within months, Stephen retook the lost territories. The puppet ruler fled or was killed. Sources differ. By 1477, Moldavia was again independent. Stephen was again in full control, and the Ottomans had nothing to show for a massive invasion except casualties and expense. Mehmed never tried again. He died in 1481, and while Ottoman-Moldavian conflicts continued for decades under his successors, Moldavia maintained its independence throughout Stephen's reign. Vaslui had done something remarkable. It had made the Ottomans reluctant. Not afraid, exactly. The Ottoman Empire didn't do afraid, but reluctant, calculating that conquering Moldavia would cost more than it was worth. That's the real victory. Not the single battle, but the strategic outcome. Moldavia, which should have been absorbed into the Ottoman Empire, like so many other Balkan principalities, remained free. Poor, constantly threatened, always one bad decision from disaster, but free. And that freedom lasted because Stephen had proven at Vaslui that Moldavia would make conquerors bleed. Stephen continued ruling until 1504. 47 years on the throne, extraordinarily long for medieval Eastern Europe, where rulers typically died violently or were overthrown. His military record became legendary. 34 battles fought, 32 won. Only Valia Alba and one other battle counted as defeats, and even those were tactical retreats rather than annihilations. No ruler in the region could match that record. But Stephen wasn't just a warrior. He was a builder. After every major victory, he commissioned a monastery. Vaslui led to Voronet Monastery, with its famous blue frescoes that still exist today. These weren't just religious buildings, they were statements of faith, thanksgiving to God, and symbols of Moldavian cultural identity. The monasteries became centers of learning, art, and Orthodox Christianity that defined Moldavian culture for centuries. He reformed administration, centralized power away from unruly boyars who might challenge him, developed trade relationships that brought wealth. He was diplomatically cunning, playing Poland against Hungary, securing papal support while maintaining Orthodox identity, making temporary alliances with the Ottomans when necessary and breaking them when survival demanded. He understood that small nations survive through flexibility, not rigidity. When Stephen died in 1504 at age 71, he was mourned across Moldavia. The Orthodox Church canonized him as Stephen the Great and Holy, recognizing not just his military achievements, but his defense of Christian faith and his generous support of religious institutions. His tomb at Putna Monastery, the same monastery where he'd prayed before Vaslui, became a pilgrimage site. The legacy of Vaslui extended far beyond Moldavia's borders. For Christian Europe, constantly under Ottoman pressure, Vaslui became a symbol. Proof that the Ottoman advance wasn't inevitable, that faith, courage, and brilliant strategy could achieve victory against overwhelming odds. When John III Sobieski of Poland defeated the Ottomans at the Siege of Vienna in 1683, over 2 centuries later, chroniclers drew parallels to Vaslui. When Skanderbeg of Albania resisted Ottoman conquest for decades, he was compared to Stephen. The battle became part of European military education, studied for its tactical lessons. For the Ottoman Empire, Vaslui was a different kind of lesson. It demonstrated that overconfidence and underestimation could be fatal, that small opponents required the same respect as major powers. Ottoman military doctrine after Vaslui emphasized intelligence gathering, careful reconnaissance, and never assuming victory based purely on numerical superiority. The Janissary Corps studied what went wrong, how fog and terrain negated their advantages, how they'd been outmaneuvered by a supposedly inferior force. In modern Romania and Moldova, the successor states to Stephen's Moldavia, Vaslui occupies a central place in national identity. Stephen the Great is arguably the most celebrated historical figure. His statue stands in Chisinau, Moldova's capital. Romanian currency has featured his image. Schools teach Vaslui as the defining moment when Romanian principalities proved they could resist foreign domination. It's national mythology, yes, but mythology rooted in genuine historical achievement. The battle's military lessons remain relevant. Military academies still study Vaslui as an example of asymmetric warfare, how to defeat a superior force through terrain manipulation, psychological operations, and unconventional tactics. The use of scorched earth, guerrilla harassment, and environmental conditions as force multipliers are all present in modern military doctrine. Stephen's understanding that you don't need to be stronger, you need to make your opponent's strength irrelevant, is timeless. But there's a deeper lesson worth considering. Vaslui happened because Stephen refused an impossible choice. Accept vassalage and watch his people slowly absorbed into the Ottoman system, their children taken, their independence eroded, or refuse and face probable destruction. Most rulers in his position chose survival through submission. Stephen chose the gamble, and he won, not through luck, though luck played a role with the fog, but through years of preparation, through studying every battle where smaller forces defeated larger ones, through understanding his terrain so intimately that he could turn it into a weapon, through building an army that trusted him enough to stand against janissaries, through psychological warfare that demoralized enemies before battle began, through the willingness to be absolutely ruthless when necessary. Think about the weight of that decision. Every Moldavian who died at Vaslui, for 1,000 men, died because Stephen refused to submit. If he'd been wrong, if the fog hadn't come, if the Ottomans hadn't taken the bait, those deaths would be his responsibility. History would remember him as the fool who gambled his nation and lost. His name would be forgotten. Moldavia would be a footnote as just another Ottoman province, and we wouldn't be talking about this battle at all. But he was right. The gamble paid off. And those 4,000 deaths bought independence for a nation, bought 50 more years of freedom, bought a legacy that inspired resistance across Eastern Europe. That's the calculation leaders face in existential moments. Is the cause worth the cost? Can you ask people to die for a plan that might fail? Stephen could, and they followed him. That says something about leadership, about trust, about shared identity. The peasants who stood with axes against janissaries didn't do it because they were forced. They did it because they believed in Stephen's vision of a free Moldavia, because they'd rather die fighting than live as subjects. That's rare. That's the kind of national cohesion that can't be manufactured. It has to be earned. Vaslui also demonstrates the limits of military power. The Ottoman Empire at its peak, with professional armies, with resources from 3 continents, with the reputation of invincibility, couldn't conquer one small principality because that principality was willing to make conquest too expensive. It's a lesson empires throughout history have had to relearn. You can win every battle and still lose the war if your opponent refuses to stay defeated. The echoes of Vaslui resonate in unexpected places. When Finland held off the Soviet Union in the Winter War of 1939-40, using terrain and weather to neutralize numerical superiority, military historians drew parallels to Vaslui. When the Viet Cong fought the United States using guerrilla tactics and intimate terrain knowledge, the strategic similarities were evident. When any smaller force uses asymmetric warfare to make conventional military strength irrelevant, that's Vaslui's legacy. But perhaps the most important legacy is simply this. It happened. Against all odds, against all logic, against every reasonable military analysis, Moldavia won. 40,000 beat 120,000. David beat Goliath, not through divine intervention alone, but through brilliant planning, perfect execution, and unwavering courage. And that means it's possible. That means impossible odds aren't actually impossible. They're just very, very difficult. That's why the story matters. Not just as history, not just as military study, but as evidence that refusal to accept defeat can sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, lead to victory. That strategic genius can overcome raw power. That small nations can survive against empires if they're willing to pay the price and smart enough to make their enemies pay a higher one. Stephen the Great died in 1504, but Vaslui lives on. In Romanian national consciousness, in military academies, in the annals of battles that changed history's trajectory, in the proof that sometimes the most important thing isn't how big your army is, it's how willing you are to use every advantage, exploit every weakness, and refuse to quit even when defeat seems certain. The snow in that valley melted centuries ago. The bodies have long since turned to dust. But the lesson remains. When backed into a corner, when facing impossible odds, when everything says you should surrender, sometimes the only rational choice is to fight anyway. And sometimes, just sometimes, you win. That's the echo of Vaslui, and it's still reverberating today. January 10th, 1475. A frozen valley. 40,000 men facing 120,000. A battle that shouldn't have been won. A victory that changed the course of Eastern European history. This is why I created Dark History Untold. Because stories like Vaslui, stories of impossible courage, brilliant strategy, and nations refusing to accept defeat, don't make it into mainstream history education. You can graduate from American schools knowing every detail of the Revolutionary War, but never hearing about the day Moldavia destroyed an Ottoman army 3 times its size. You can study World War II extensively, but never learn about Stephen the Great, who won 34 out of 36 battles across a 47-year reign. That's not an accident. History education tends to focus on stories that serve specific narratives, that fit into neat geographical and political categories. Eastern European medieval conflicts, they get lost, overshadowed by the Crusades, by the 100 Years' War, by the more familiar narratives of Western European power struggles. But these stories matter. They matter because they show human capability at its peak. They matter because they demonstrate that empires aren't invincible, that strategic genius can overcome brute force, that small nations can survive when everyone expects them to disappear. They matter because they're true. Stephen the Great wasn't a character in a Hollywood movie. He was a real person who made an impossible decision and lived with the consequences. The 4,000 Moldavians who died at Vaslui were real people with families, with hopes, with futures that ended in that frozen valley. The 40,000 Ottomans who never made it home, they were real too. Sons, brothers, fathers, human beings caught in the machinery of empire and resistance. War isn't glorious. Vaslui wasn't a clean victory where good triumphed over evil. It was brutal, terrifying. Men drowning in frozen rivers, peasants with axes hacking through armor. 3 days of pursuit where quarter wasn't given because mercy meant future invasions. Stephen made ruthless decisions because survival required ruthlessness. That's the reality of medieval warfare. That's the reality of existential conflict. But within that brutal reality, there's something worth remembering. People can achieve the impossible when they refuse to accept defeat, when they prepare meticulously, when they exploit every advantage, when they're willing to sacrifice everything for something they believe in. That's not romanticizing war. That's acknowledging human capacity. The Ottoman Empire was the superpower of the 15th century. Moldavia was a minor principality that most Europeans couldn't locate on a map. By every rational measure, Moldavia should have become another Ottoman province, its people absorbed into the empire, its identity erased. Instead, it remained free. Stephen died in his bed at 71, having defended his nation for nearly 5 decades. That happened because one man refused to sell his people into slavery and had the genius to back up that refusal with strategy. Think about what that means for you, for us, for anyone facing situations where the odds seem impossible, where conventional wisdom says give up, where everyone advises compromise because fighting seems futile. Vaslui doesn't guarantee that refusing to quit leads to victory. History is full of brave failures, but it proves that sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible becomes possible through preparation, strategy, and unwavering determination. If this story moved you, if you're thinking about it hours from now, if you're going to remember Stephen the Great and the Battle of Vaslui, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications, because Dark History Untold exists to bring you stories exactly like this one. Stories that challenge what you think you know about history. Stories that inspire, that educate, that prove the past was far more complex and fascinating than textbooks suggest. Drop a comment telling me what struck you most about this battle. Was it Stephen's refusal to submit? The tactical brilliance of the ambush? The sheer scale of the Ottoman defeat? The pursuit? The legacy? I read every comment, and your engagement helps this channel grow, helps these forgotten stories reach more people who need to hear them. Share this video with anyone who loves military history, who appreciates underdog stories, who needs a reminder that impossible odds aren't actually impossible. Hit that like button if this was worth your time. And if you want to support the channel directly, check out the membership options. Your support keeps these deep research documentaries coming. Next time on Dark History Untold, we're covering another battle that defied expectations, another moment when the course of history pivoted on decisions made by people who refused to accept defeat. I'm not going to spoil it, but trust me, if Vaslui impressed you, you're going to want to see what's coming next. History isn't just dates and names. It's human beings making impossible choices under unimaginable pressure. It's strategic genius competing against overwhelming force. It's the proof that small groups of determined people can change the world, or at least stop empires from ending it. The Battle of Vaslui happened 550 years ago, but its lessons remain. Its inspiration endures. And as long as people face impossible odds, as long as small nations stand against empires, as long as anyone refuses to accept that defeat is inevitable, Vaslui matters. Remember Stephen the Great. Remember the 40,000 Moldavians who stood against 120,000 Ottomans. Remember the frozen valley where impossible became reality. And remember that history is full of moments like this. You just have to know where to look. FL. This has been Dark History Untold. I'll see you in the next one.